Joining me on the channel today is Kylie Schacte, author of the YA novel You're Next, out now from Little Brown. It's about a teen girl investigating the murder of her ex-girlfriend. Welcome, Kylie.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for having me.
I always like to start at the beginning and explore your journey to becoming a writer. So what kind of kid were you?
I think I was probably a pretty typical writer baby, in that, super dreamy, always doing sort of like these elaborate imaginative games that I was like trying to explain to my friends, these very like intricate rules of these like make pretend games that they were sort of dubiously interested in. But yeah, I've been writing my whole life, pretty much like as soon as I could like pick up a pencil, I was writing little stories and things like that. So it's kind of always been a part of who I am, and sort of perhaps counterintuitively to that, like for that reason, I think it just never really occurred to me that this was a thing to pursue as a career, or like that this was a thing I wanted to do with my life, because it was just such a like natural extension of who I was. So for the longest time, I never really like envisioned myself actually being an author. I went to college, and after graduating, I had been studying theater in college and graduated with the intention of moving to LA and becoming an actor. So that was kind of supposed to be my outlet for storytelling, and that sort of gradually turned into taking my fiction writing more seriously.
Oh my God, so many writers, it seems like, started out as theater kids.
Yeah, yeah.
And did you do theater in high school?
I did theater all through high school, and then went to college to study theater. Did like a conservatory in Moscow, Russia, studying theater.
Cool.
So like that was 100% the path that I thought that I was on. My parents were always really like skeptical of the whole acting thing, and were always trying to like encourage me to pursue writing instead. Turns out that they were right all along. So yeah, I think that there is a lot of like obviously crossover. It's just two different kinds of storytelling. One of the things that I think I'm really grateful for my background in theater, something that I think acting gives you that is hard to get out of writing, is it's kind of forced vulnerability. I mean, you're doing it in real time in front of other people. You're getting that live reaction, particularly if it's stage acting. But even for film, I think like, you've got all the other people on set and things like that who are interacting with you. For writing, for me, especially because it's something I've kind of always been good at, I have so much more control over it. Like I get to decide exactly how edited and finished and polished I want a sentence to be before anybody else ever looks at it, which I love being the control freak that I am, but at the same time, I think makes it too easy sometimes to take a step back and really from any kind of vulnerability, and really focus more on like putting pretty words on the page that don't have a lot of substance behind them. And so I do find myself kind of like drawing from my acting experience a lot to make sure that I'm putting that sort of like rawness and vulnerability on there that I wouldn't have had a choice to exhibit if I were acting still.
Yeah, I find that the plays that people did in high school have a profound impact on them. Do you remember the plays that you did in high school?
I do. My high school was funny. We had this really incredible head of the theater department who was, by the time I was in high school, I believe like in her late 70s or early 80s. So she was sort of like the grand dame of theater in our school, and she ruled the theater department with an iron fist. And she, I think, was like getting close to retirement. And as a result of that, was kind of like, fuck it, I'm going to do like just the plays that I feel like doing. And they were always the most obscure plays that nobody had ever heard of. So like the town next to ours was always doing like Rent and like stuff that like everybody knew and would find popular and would want to see. And we were doing like this adaptation of an Agatha Christie novel called Witness for the Prosecution that like nobody had ever heard of. It's not even a particularly popular Agatha Christie. We did Brigadoon, which is a musical that like only the direst of theater nerds have ever heard of. So we were doing like some real random shit. But we were sort of like the scrappy crappy underdog theater department compared to like the very glossy, like expensive, high profile one in the town next door, very much like a Sharks and Jets kind of situation. So yeah, we were always doing like really obscure stuff, but I think that there was a lot of like fun to be found in that too.
Yeah, definitely. And where are you from? What town did you go to high school in?
I went to high school in Weston, Connecticut. So I actually like moved around a bunch as a kid. So I lived in Los Angeles until I was 12 or 13. And then I lived in New York for a little while and then Connecticut. So was like the new kid in my very small high school, very small town Connecticut high school. It was like the only new kid. Everybody else had been going to school together since they were in kindergarten or something. So yeah, definitely a formative experience.
And what kind of books did you like reading as a kid?
You know, people who knew me when I was younger often surprised that I ended up writing a mystery because, particularly as a kid, I was mostly drawn to fantasy. So I was definitely that sort of like dreamy, escapist kind of kid. So as a child, I was reading a lot of like, Roald Dahl, Eva Ibbotson, who wrote like The Secret of Platform 13. I loved all of her books. The Last of the Really Great Whangdoodles, which is a lesser known classic by Julie Andrews, like from The Sound of Music. So those were all like the kinds of like
I feel like
portal
someone
favorites.
else mentioned that.
It's so good. I can't believe more people don't know about it,
Yeah.
especially since Julie Andrews wrote it. But it is like one of my all-time favorite kids books. So that was like very much what I was into, as a kid. And then as I got into high school, I feel like I was that generation right before young adult really took off as a genre. So there were some YA books when I was in high school, but not really of the kind that we would think of now. Like I think Twilight came, which is sort of in my mind, like the start of the current YA boom. I think that came out like either right as I was graduating high school or right after. And so I kind of skipped straight into adult books. When I was in high school, I was reading a lot of, perhaps unsurprisingly, I went through like a deep Chuck Palahniuk phase. So I was reading like Fight Club, for instance, and all of his other books. I was really into that sort of like gritty kind of thing. I was a sort of angsty, troubled teenager. And so that type of thing really appealed to me. But when I graduated from high school, when I was coming home for the summers to like I was leaving college and coming home for the summer, I started working in the kids section of Barnes & Noble, which included the YA section. And that was when YA was just becoming popular. And I had this phenomenal boss who was the manager of the kids section at the time, who was basically like, when you have downtime, when there's nobody here, when we don't have like stuff that we need to be doing, just always be reading books so that you can make recommendations for people, which like I was getting paid to read. I was totally fine with that. And that's, I think, really where I like rediscovered young adult as the genre exists now and became really obsessed with it and started writing a lot of it on my own.
Awesome. And so your path to becoming a writer started at Barnes and Noble?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I think had always been, like I said, I had always been writing, but it was really then that I started thinking more seriously about specific genres and what was available on the market. And I was reading all of the new releases that were coming out. I was taking creative writing classes in college. And so I just recently did like a deep dive through all my old writing because we're all stuck at home right now and what other things do I have to do? So started going through a lot of stuff that I had written like in high school and in college. And you can sort of see this transition when I started working at Barnes & Noble into writing more things that were more kind of classically what we would think of as middle grade or YA, and starting to explore those spaces. So I think at that point, I probably still didn't consider myself a writer or consider that to be like a career I wanted to pursue, but you can like see it starting to happen in my writing, me putting all of those pieces together.
Awesome. And tell us about the day that you found out your book was going to be published.
Yeah. So it was actually my birthday. It was 2018. We had just adopted a dog the day before, we hadn't, I think, officially decided we were going to adopt her, but we had brought her home for like the trial period. And so, it was like a little bit stressful. We had like a new animal in the house. Like I hadn't been sleeping particularly well because I was really worried about her getting settled and all of that kind of stuff. So when you, once you have an agent and you start sending your book out to publishers, it's called being on sub, where your agent is pretty much in charge of like being the one to send manuscripts to publishers and kind of managing all of that communication with them. So you're not really like in contact with publishers directly if you go sort of the traditional publishing route. But I had been on sub for about 6 months at that point, and I had gotten in this really bad habit of waking up so I live in Portland on the West Coast. I had gotten in this really bad habit of waking up at 6 a.m. my time, because that was 9 a.m. Eastern time where most agents are located, just to like see if I had gotten any news. And it had been going on for months. Like it wasn't even like I was setting an alarm. My brain would just sort of naturally wake up at 6 and be like, time to check.
I relate to that too, because I'm also on the West Coast at the time that this was happening. And I also got accustomed to checking my email at 6 a.m.
It's a bad habit. So, cause it's like first thing I had to sort of learn to maybe take a breath when I first woke up and not have that be the first thing that I did. But I had been awake and kind of like tossing and turning all night because of the dog anyway. So I woke up really early. It was my birthday, and opened my email and finally, like after 6 months, had an email from my agent saying we had an offer from,
Happy birthday.
Yes, exactly. And so I got this email, like I immediately burst into tears, and I'm not like a super emotional crier. Like I tend not to have that kind of intense emotional outburst. I'm sort of a notoriously like chill, everything's fine type of person. So I burst into tears. It's 6 a.m. So my husband is still fast asleep. And so I like tried to nudge him awake to tell him, and he was too like, oh, that's great, honey, like groggy at that point, and like not giving me the proper reaction that I needed. So I called my mom, and because it was my birthday, she answers the phone with this big like, happy birthday. And I'm sobbing hysterically to the point where I can't get a word out. And so she immediately switches into mom mode where she's like, what's wrong? Who hurt you? What's happening? Please tell me everything. And I like, she's getting more and more freaked out because I really cannot calm down. And so finally I managed to like croak out a couple of words about how we had an offer on the book, and she was so pissed that I had scared her that badly. So she spent about like 3 minutes yelling at me to like never scare her that way again before she calmed down enough to be super excited and congratulate me and all of that. So it was a good day. It was certainly a good birthday. Got a new dog and a book deal.
Which is interesting because, well, you have like a star map on your map behind you. So you must be slightly into astrology, maybe a little bit.
A little bit. Yeah.
Okay.
Definitely.
But both a children's book and a dog are both fifth house topics. So I wonder if you had some really intense activity on your birthday in your fifth house.
That is, I mean, I would have to check that out. Yeah, I do know that I'm always like very interested in astrology and like that type of stuff, but I only kind of dabble in it. But I do remember actually the night before I had done a tarot drawing, and I can't remember what card, and I had done it specifically because I was starting to feel really down about being on sub, and like there hadn't been any news for a while, which I should say 6 months is not that long to have a book out there. So it was mostly just me being neurotic, but I was starting to feel kind of pessimistic about it. And I had done a drawing, and I knew that there was possibly an offer coming because we had heard that there was some interest and we should have news soon, but that had been like weeks earlier and we hadn't heard anything, and I was starting to feel like, well, this is probably not happening if we haven't heard by now. So I did this tarot drawing to see, and I can't remember what cards I pulled, but I have a picture of the drawing on my phone because I remember looking at it and being like, if I get an offer tomorrow, I'm going to want to remember what these cards were, because like it was as clear as day, like something is huge, life-changing news is going to happen, and it's going to involve like a very famous man in your field, like reaching out to make you some kind of offer, which of course, like the imprint that I was originally published under was Jimmy Patterson, which is one of James Patterson. So it was just like couldn't have been clearer what was about to happen. So I took a picture of it. I have it on my phone. I can't remember what the cards are now.
Oh, I wonder what the cards were. I'm dying to know. I kept on pulling the 3 of Pentacles right before my book deal, and that's like the card of like making agreements and contracts. And
Yes. So yeah, I think definitely some kind of like mystical energy happening. But I have always said, like the offer came in the day after we brought the dog home, and she's now my like good luck charm book deal dog. And so we hadn't like fully committed to keeping her at that point. We were just bringing her home for a trial period, and I was like, well, I guess like a sign's a sign. We gotta stick around.
I love it. What's your dog's name?
Clementine.
Clementine. Aw.
She's a sweet girl.
And what kind of dog is she?
She's a Great Dane.
Oh
Um,
my gosh.
yeah,
I love the
she's the
big
best.
boos. I love them. Oh my.
Yes, she is a giant baby. She loves to lie down like literally on top of me, all 130 pounds of her.
Oh my
And I'm
god.
like a small person. No, she's the best, and like was obviously a great decision on many counts.
And so now you're published. Oh, what was a misconception that you had about publishing prior to being published that has now changed?
Oh God, so many. I think like people will tell you how slow publishing is, and I just don't think that there's any way to like truly understand that until you've like really lived it. Like I actually, by like any measure, have a pretty speedy journey through publishing. And the total amount of time start to finish from when I began writing the book to the day it came out um, is about 6 years. So like granted, at least half of that time was like before I really got serious about publishing it, but like my journey to getting an agent, the amount of time that it took me to sign with an agent, the amount of time that it took us to be on sub, like all of that was relatively fast as far as these things go, and yet every stage of it has felt just like a never-ending eternity. And you know, by any sort of like reasonable outside of publishing measure, you know, months and months of waiting to hear news is a really long time. But yeah, there's just no way to like fully understand how slow publishing actually is until you're in the middle of it. And I know that now and have experienced it many times, and yet anytime I'm waiting for news, I still find myself falling into that cycle of like, well, it's been 6 weeks and I haven't heard anything. So that clearly means that like, it's never going to happen. It's over. Like, book's never getting published. They don't want it. And every single time I've been wrong. But it never stops me from falling into that cycle.
And was Your Next your first book that you attempted to write?
Yes. So I had been in progress on a couple of other what I thought were going to be books prior to that, but this is the first manuscript that I ever like wrote all the way through to the end. So I had like maybe gotten a quarter of the way through like one or two other things before it, but nothing that I ever got to the end of.
Yeah, got it. Okay. And so Picture Book, tell us about it. What makes it?
Yeah. So Your Next is about a 16-year-old detective named Flora Calhoun. She is running this kind of like under the table private investigator business in her high school. She was really inspired to get involved in doing that kind of stuff because a couple of years earlier, when she was 14, she went out for a run one morning and found the pretty brutally murdered body of a classmate. And her kind of obsession with that case and her firsthand experience seeing how justice was not served really inspired her to get kind of obsessive about criminal justice in general. And so she's running this private investigation business where she's solving like stolen laptops and like cheating significant others, like pretty minor school type stuff. But at the start of the book, her kind of ex-girlfriend, you know, it's one of those situations that's just like, were we dating? Were we not? I think we've all been there at some point. Her kind of ex-girlfriend is murdered, and she becomes, you know, obsessed with this being the case where she finally gets it right, because that first one she, in her mind, had messed up. And so, you know, her investigation into her ex-girlfriend Ava's murder takes her into this pretty like deadly fight club that the kids in her school and a lot of the neighboring schools are fighting in for cash, and it's kind of causing all of these rifts within the fabric of her school and her community, and finding that like pretty much everybody that she knows has some kind of secret that they're keeping that you know, one of them might have killed for. So yeah, it's got like a Riverdale vibe to it, a Fight Club vibe to it. It's kind of like film noir meets high school, and it's all told through the first person perspective of Flora, the main character, who is, you know, kind of a prickly, hard-boiled detective meets 16-year-old girl. A friend of mine once said that like my entire brand as a writer is taking the like stereotypical characters of old white dudes and giving them to teenage girls instead. And so like, to me, that's really the best encapsulation of what I try to write.
Love it. And what's your favorite step? Is it drafting or revising?
Drafting 100%. There's a specific phase of drafting. I think that is the phase that I enjoy the most, which is like, it's not the very beginning where it's like total blank page in front of you. And like you're having to sort of summon a world out of nothingness. It's just after you've gotten like enough of the details figured out that you're not having to like start from scratch every time you sit down to write, but you also are still really free to like mess things up and try different things and experiment in a way that like by the time you get to revising, you have to start thinking about, okay, well, how do I actually make this stuff work? I'm kind of always fighting that sort of perfectionist inner editor type of mindset. And so that phase of drafting where I draft mostly by hand for first drafts. And so when I'm writing by hand and I'm writing super sloppily and I don't have to worry about like, oh, I've used the same word 7 times in this page or whatever, like that's my sweet spot. And I'm always trying to find like, how can I take some of the elements of that and apply them to the revising part so that it feels less painful and torturous.
What has been the best revision technique or tip that you've gotten along the way?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in one of my, I think I'd have to say that like finding ways to put us deeper inside the main character's point of view. So when I'm drafting, I'm just kind of like trying to figure out what even is happening in the scene. And I'm not necessarily paying super careful attention to like, here's the emotional note that I want the reader to feel at this moment. And here's like the super specific detail that I want to include here. But when I go back and revise, that's when I have to start thinking about like, okay, this isn't, to my mind, like most writing that we enjoy is not just like a pure recitation of events. Like here's what happened now, and then this happened, and then this happened. Every single scene is accomplishing like a few different things at once. And so one of the things that I try to be really mindful of when I'm revising is when I'm including specific details, whether it's sensory details or like the physical description of the scene or whatever, is thinking about like, what could I replace this paragraph with, which is just telling you straight up what happened. What kinds of like details could I include here that are going to hint at, the main character's emotional state or develop deeper characterization of this other character instead. And so like the two things that I look out for the most are something that I think a lot of people refer to as filtering. So like where the example I always give is like, I heard my father's footsteps down the hall versus my father's footsteps echoed down the hall. In the first one, the character is telling us that they heard them, but we're like not hearing it alongside them. We're being told about it after the fact versus in the second one, my father's footsteps echoed down the hall. You're hearing it at the same time. So I spend a lot of time doing that just so that we're like fully immersed in the main character's POV. And then not only that, but thinking about like, okay, once we're fully immersed, then I can start to include these like interesting physical descriptions and details that like the reader wouldn't necessarily have thought of on their own. So there's a passage in my book that I'm really proud of. There's kind of like this really intense emotional conversation happening between Flora, the main character, and one of her love interests. And there was a line when I was doing the revising that was just something like, I look away, unable to meet his eyes, or something like that. Pretty basic sentence. It's not like, nobody would be mad about it. It's not egregious. It was fine the way it was. But I was trying to ask myself, like, okay, what's a more immersive detail that I could include here instead that would communicate the same sort of emotional thing, but we'd feel it more deeply. And so instead of just saying that she looked away, I had her describe in detail this couch that the guy had that looked like the kind of couch that you like hauled in off the street corner for free. And it's sort of like grimy and stained and, the seams are busting or whatever. And by showing the way that she described the detail of the couch, it showed like how like focused she was on like not looking at him, because she's really putting a lot of attention on this thing we would normally not want to look at that hard. And then in addition to that, it also did a little bit of characterization for the guy as well, because he lives this kind of lonely, isolated existence. He's pushed a lot of people away from him. He's kind of broken himself. And so I think in the same scene, we learn that his kitchen table only has one chair. It's like we're sort of highlighting this kind of like dark, lonely apartment that he lives in, as well as showing her kind of like need to not engage with him at the moment. So it's trying to find those details of like if I left a reader to their own devices to picture the scene on their own, that's not the kind of thing that they would have come up with. They would have imagined all kinds of other amazing things, but it wouldn't have been that. And that to me is like my job as an author, is to offer that level of like specificity, and the kind that works at a bunch of different layers. So it's doing physical description, but it's also doing characterization, and it's also doing emotional beats. So that to me is like the sort of crux of all of my revision advice, is like, how can I make one detail or one beat do many different things at the same time?
Genius. I love that. And are you a perfectionist or a chaos artist?
A little bit of both. I think that I think I'm like a perfectionist that doesn't want to admit that she's a perfectionist. So I don't identify as being like a super type A, like having calendars and stickies and like all of that kind of stuff. I actually see myself as more of kind of a slacker, go with the flow kind of person. But when it comes to writing, I find that the number one thing that gets in my way is my sort of like obsession with having every sentence be perfect. And if I get so bogged down in, especially in the drafting phase, of like I can't move on until I figure out like the exact way to say this sentence. I just like, I end up not writing at all, which is obviously not ideal. So, so much of my drafting part of the process is about kind of like tricking myself into writing, or, just being like, I can write total garbage. I'm going to try and write something that's bad right now. And that sort of tends to flip that switch of perfectionism where I'm like, this doesn't really matter. I'm just sort of goofing off. And I'm still kind of learning how to apply that same mindset to revision of like, this is fine. Nothing matters. I'm allowed to like, know that this isn't perfect yet, but I'll come back to it later. So yeah, that perfectionism thing I think really trips me up as a writer.
Do you have a huge ego, or are you humble as a reader?
Um, I think I often come. I don't want to say I come across as having a huge ego, but I think I do have a pretty big ego about my own writing. I think, like I said, writing is something that has just always come naturally to me. It was like a thing I knew how to, it's the first thing I can remember knowing exactly how to do, and not needing to necessarily be told. Obviously, I've learned so much from many different teachers and educators along the way, but it just sort of like, I knew what I was doing from the beginning. And so I think that having that kind of talent can definitely give you a big ego. And so getting to a place of having to participate in the actual publishing industry and work my way through that has been a really humbling experience, because anybody who has published a book or is on the path to publication will tell you that like being talented is just like not even close to being enough. You need so much perseverance and dedication, and willingness to collaborate with other people. And so I'm like so admiring of other people who have kind of like the hustle that I think I don't always have, because I was so used to it just coming naturally to me. Sometimes I'm like, hey, wait a minute, I have to work at this sometimes. So I think definitely more on the ego side, but when it comes to like the actual writing itself. But when it comes to like how to navigate the industry, I'm like all humility and just trying to like learn whatever I can from anyone I can.
Are you a morning writer or an evening writer?
Morning, 100%. So my path to publication really got jump started in 2017 when I applied to and was accepted into Pitch Wars, which is like a writing mentorship program. And I worked with the incredible YA writer, Amy Trueblood. She was my mentor. We rewrote the entire book from scratch. So she loved the main character. She loved Flora's voice. Everything else had to go. So Pitch Wars was at the time about 2 months long, and so I had 2 months to replot and rewrite my entire book in preparation for this agent showcase. So I had so much work to do. I started waking up at 4:30 just so that I could get like enough hours of writing in before I had to go to my job, so that I could actually just get everything done. And as much as it sucked doing that, I did find that I'm definitely my most productive that early in the morning. And so I don't wake up quite that early now unless I'm on like a real serious deadline. But I do wake up at like 5 or 6 and get started with writing right away on the days that I do write.
Are you a plotter or a pantser?
Um, Kind of in the middle. So plantser, I guess. I I can only really see like 50 feet in front of me at any given moment. So I draft a book in stages. So I usually come up with like the first 30% of the book pretty early on, and then I start drafting that and actually figuring it out in progress. And so much of whatever I had thought was going to happen in the beginning completely changes in that part. So I kind of have like a rough sense of it. I do what I call a notes draft, which is basically like scene directions, like from a play or something like that. It's me just kind of like rambling notes of what happens in every scene. And then I write the actual scene by hand, and then I type up the scene and kind of edit it as I go. So I do that for about the first 30% of the book. And then at that point, I feel like I have a good enough sense of where it was actually going that I do that for another 30% and then another, and so I sort of do it in chunks like that, because so much changes in the beginning part of the book, like when I actually get to the drafting stage, that trying to sit down and plot the entire thing all in one go would to me feel like a big waste of effort, because I know so much of it is going to change. So a little bit of both.
Are you a character first or a plot first writer?
100% character first. So every story idea I have always starts with a character, and that was definitely true for Your Next as well. So Flora came to me first. I was watching TV one night and I just had this idea about this 16-year-old detective. I had no idea what her name was. I just like stopped everything and wrote this random scene of her hiding from a bunch of mafia guys that didn't make it into the book. But it was just like, I look back and read it now, and I like already had pretty much her voice like nailed in my head from that first moment. And that's usually how I know whether an idea is viable or not. I don't always have their voice so exactly down right away, but if within the first few weeks of thinking about them, I can't really figure out what their voice is, then to me, it's like I don't really know how I would pursue it any further. I have to kind of have them in my head in order to, like the way that they talk and the way that they move, in order to know what's going to happen with the rest of the story.
Would you ever like to be famous?
Sure. I get DMs and emails and things like that from people who have read the book, and like nothing makes me happier. It just like completely makes my day every single time. And so like if I could have a million more of those, I would definitely not complain. So yeah, I think the sort of fame celebrity side of things is not the part that's like that exciting to me, but the idea of like lots and lots of people reading my books, like hell yeah, I would take that.
And what non-supernatural talent or ability would you like to have?
Um, I would give almost anything to be able to write faster. And I feel like so much of my learning about the writing process, and so much of my kind of exploration of how I write in the last few years has really been about how can I do this faster. So yeah, I think there are people out there who do like fast drafts in a month, 6 weeks, whatever, and I'm just completely in awe of them. And I think honestly that probably comes back to that same perfectionist thing. I think if I weren't so busy like internally editing and self-rejecting things, I could probably write a lot faster, because I wasn't so bogged down in getting everything right. So that's a big part of like what I'm striving towards right now. Is I'd love to be one of those people who can just like whip out a really rough, messy draft in a month.
What are you working on next?
So right now I'm working on this queer YA Indiana Jones book. It's about these, and it's like a hate to love romance as well. So it's about these two girls who are in the same AP US history class, and they can't stand each other. They have been, through a series of unfortunate events, forced to team up to study for their AP exam together. In the process of doing so, in this old library, they find this like old treasure map that they think belonged to this legendary gang of like all female queer pirates from the Civil War era, and so become obsessed with finding their treasure and proving that these women existed. So I like to tell people, unlike Your Next, it has like not even a little bit of murder in it. So nobody dies, everybody's fine. Your Next, I loved writing, but it's so dark and gritty and really heart-wrenching, and like you never know, like literally anybody could be next. All of your favorite characters, like any one of them could be knocked off at any moment. But so yeah, this is kind of like my lighthearted romp that I did almost as like a palate cleanser after Your Next, and I'm having a lot of fun reading it so far.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to that. That sounds
Thank
awesome.
you.
Everyone check out Your Next. I put buy links below and links and follow Kylie on social media. Thank you so much for being on the channel.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a lot of fun. I really appreciate it.